Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends. Welcome back to our ProRevenge series. In today's episode, you'll hear 4 exciting stories. The first story is about a manager who tries to get an employee fired, but it backfires terribly. The second story involves an employee's boss firing him to hire her nephew. The third story features an employee who is framed by his manager, but gets some sweet revenge. My friends, I hope you stay for these stories today and hit that subscribe button for more stories in the future. Let me give you some background. I work for a communications company that primarily sells internet-based all-in-one communication solutions for businesses. I'm in the software development department, currently working as a software tester. I've been with the company for a very long time, having worked my way up from phone support. I have a ton of knowledge about the company, including its policies and culture. I also have a relative who has worked in HR for many years. So here's the story. I've been working as a software tester for about 2 years, doing manual testing. Our team was fairly unsupervised, so we didn't have a manager. However, the company was expanding quickly, so they hired a manager named Jay. At first, things were fine. He was just learning about the company. Oddly, he never asked anyone for information. Instead, he said he'd do his own research and spent the first month reading online. I'm not sure what that taught him about our company specifically, though. After the first month, Jay hit the ground running. He immediately started creating automation tests, adding to the existing testing code, and creating ridiculous rules that made no sense. He broke tons of programs and took credit for work that wasn't his. Most people on the team hated him, but we all ignored him for the most part. At this point, no one had explicitly said he was our manager. He was just there to provide direction. Fast forward a few months, and everyone on the team wanted to quit. No one could stand him. Jay and I clashed more than others because I knew he was wrong, and I made decisions based on the best interests of the customers. He hated that I never got in trouble, especially since I was hand-selected for my position by our CIO, who knew how hard I worked. Jay kept trying to get me in trouble, and he finally succeeded. I received a write-up from him, stating it was my final warning before termination. I had never been written up before, so I went to HR to review the company handbook. Then I fought the write-up with HR and won. Instead of termination, I got a warning, and Jay was furious. He gave me the stink eye for months afterward. Fast forward again, and he was still after me. I had a family emergency coming up requiring me to move out of town. I applied to work from home, and my request was granted. Jay couldn't stand it. He tried to fight it and convince the company to deny my request, but he wasn't high enough in the chain to override the approval from a C-level manager. He was running out of time to get me fired. I was in the office working late daily, planning for my move and finishing up work to allow me time off. One of our department's policies was that everyone could work from home 1 day a week, as long as it wasn't Monday or Friday. People often used this when they were sick. I have a medical condition that sometimes requires me to take medicine, which means I can't drive. I emailed the office to let them know I'd be working from home due to being sick. I worked for about 30 minutes before Jay sent me a message. He claimed employees weren't allowed to pick their work-from-home days and told me to take the day off using personal time off PTO. I informed him that I had already worked part of the day, so I couldn't take PTO. He insisted I stop working immediately, so I did. Then, I contacted HR because I knew he was targeting me. I confirmed that as a salaried employee, if I work at all in a day, I cannot be required to take time off. HR confirmed this, and I forwarded the email to Jay. Once again, I won, and he was so angry I could practically see steam coming out of his ears every time he looked at me. The next day, I was back at work. Jay sent me an email with a final write-up, recommending termination because I took an unauthorized day off. I immediately forwarded this to HR, along with proof that he had told me to take the day, including screenshots of our conversations and the previous HR decision I had sent him. I also included that I was filing a formal complaint against him for creating a hostile workplace, targeting, bullying, retaliating, and violating my ADA rights. The response was swift, sweet, and awesome. I was immediately notified by Jay's boss that I would now report directly to him. My write-up was discarded, and I could start working from home immediately before my move. Jay was demoted from being the team's manager, and he was furious. Within 2 weeks, he was demoted from managing his other team, and within a month, he was let go. Before his termination, I was promoted to a higher level, which he couldn't stand. After I exposed his true colors to management, he began treating everyone else worse, as I was now off limits. Complaints rolled in so much that they had to let him go. Serves him right. I've worked for a few power-tripping bosses before, and I can tell you it's a terrible experience just to be at work. This story is absolutely wonderful. Far too many people think that just because they have the title of manager or supervisor, they can pick on others and treat them poorly. What a great revenge! Next story? This happened several years ago. I was working for a small medical supply company as the IT manager. Business was bad, and eventually the IT department downsized to just me. During this time, they brought in a new CFO named Pam, whom I had to report to directly. Pam had zero knowledge of IT and how things worked. Her motto was, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." The couple who owned the company were pretty shady too. During a quarterly meeting, when people asked about job security, the owners assured everyone that nobody was getting laid off and that our jobs were secure. That was at 5 o'clock in the evening on a Wednesday. The very next morning at 9 o'clock, they laid off 6 people. By noon, one of the owners showed up to show off the Escalade he had just purchased that morning. During the first 6 months Pam was there, she fired everyone who had worked for the previous CFO and replaced them with her friends and family. 3 of her bridesmaids from her wedding a few years ago were hired to replace those she fired. I knew I was on borrowed time. After she had been there for 9 months, I was the only one left out of the 12 people who had worked for the old CFO. I'd been looking for work, but the 2009 crash had just happened, and the job market in my area was tough. Sure enough, Pam called me into HR and blindsided me with a completely fabricated charge, claiming it had happened the day before. I had been working with the VP of sales on a project the entire day, so I had a witness. I asked to bring him in since my boss was lying, but I was told, "This is not about him, this is about you." I knew my days were numbered. The next morning, I was introduced to an IT expert who just happened to be Pam's 21-year-old nephew. He was supposed to shadow me and evaluate everything I did to see if we could streamline my processes. In other words, they wanted me to train him to do my job. I quickly learned that this kid had absolutely no knowledge of IT. He was the kind of person people think is an IT expert because he can hook up a PlayStation to a TV. He didn't even know how to join a PC to a domain. I knew what had to be done. The inventory, billing, shipping, and receiving were all run by scripts I had created on the server using the domain admin account. I raised a fuss about giving him the domain admin account in front of Pam and him. I loudly proclaimed that I was going to change the password since non-employees shouldn't have admin access to the network. I was overruled and told to give him the password. I complied, but I also showed him multiple times how to change the passwords on the domain. I even had him write it down to ensure he could do it. I stressed the importance of changing the admin password and deleting the local account the second he was no longer consulting with us. I showed him a few things, but nothing about what really made the company run. There wasn't enough time in a year to bring this kid up to speed due to his complete lack of IT knowledge. The next day, I was let go because Pam's nephew had found my skills lacking in many areas. I collected my last paycheck and headed home. The next morning, I got a call from the CFO and the owners. Apparently, Pam's nephew wasn't quite up to speed on everything we did there. She graciously offered to pay me my regular salary to come in as a consultant and get her nephew up to speed on the IT infrastructure. I told her that I was now an independent contractor, and if she wanted my services, I would charge $200 per hour with a 250-hour minimum. At that point, she threatened to call the police and have me arrested for what I did if I didn't come in and fix everything. My response was, "Just so we're clear, you fired me, replaced me with a completely unqualified person, and now you're threatening to call the cops on me if I don't come in to fix what he did? I'll hold, please call the police and let me know what they say." She started yelling at me and I hung up. It turns out her nephew did learn something from me. He changed the admin password after I left, the one that ran all the scripts for inventory, billing, shipping, and ordering. According to some of my coworkers, the place was dead in the water for several days until they could get a real consultant to go through the documentation I had created to fix the issue. The nephew was immediately fired, and Pam was gone within a month. I know Pam thought she was doing a favor by bringing in people and giving them jobs, but that's the quickest way to destroy a company. A friend of mine had a similar experience. He used to work at an express oil change and car repair shop. The old owner sold the place, and the new owners took over, firing all the staff. They brought in their friends and family, and the place gained a horrible reputation for doing shoddy work. It went downhill as soon as the new owners took over and fired everyone who had worked there for over 10 years. At least in this situation, the owners recognized that Pam was the problem and hopefully saved their business. Next story. My nephew Bob had a job selling cell phones in a store in a mall. The store was owned by a licensed distributor of one of the big-name brands. He was very good at convincing customers to buy calling plans, extended warranties, and accessories that were highly profitable. Pretty soon, he was the #1 salesman in the store. The owners asked him to transfer to their other store in a different mall, replacing the assistant manager who had just been fired. In addition to an increase in his base pay, he'd get a cut of every sale he made while he was in charge. It took him about 2 days to figure out why sales were down, clueless sales reps and lousy management. The manager would disappear for hours at a time, leaving the sales reps to sit around ignoring customers. Most employees would show up late, leave early, or not even bother coming in at all. When they did speak to a customer, they had no idea how to make a sale. On his first day, Bob outsold them all after making sure the guys on his shift were actually doing their jobs, especially when it came to selling high-profit add-ons. The store's sales improved. The store manager saw what was happening and wasn't happy. He knew it was only a matter of time before he was replaced by Bob. One day they received a shipment of new phones. As usual, Bob signed for them and locked them in the storage closet. The next day was his day off, but the manager called and insisted he come in immediately because there was a problem. Overnight, someone had broken into the store and stolen about 100 brand new phones. Mall security cameras showed 2 people driving up to the back door, opening it with a key, shutting off the alarm, and walking out with the phones. The police were called and Bob was questioned for a couple of hours, but they had no evidence against him, and he had an alibi. However, the manager convinced the owners that Bob was probably involved since he had signed for the phones, had keys to the door and storage closet, and knew the alarm code. Bob argued that they hadn't changed the locks or code after firing the previous assistant manager and that anyone could have known about the shipment. Nevertheless, he was fired, or rather, they allowed him to resign, and they withheld his last commission check. At the other end of the mall was a store that sold phones for a competing cell company. They knew that since Bob had joined the other store, their sales had suffered. They hired him on the spot, and their sales improved overnight. One of Bob's favorite strategies was to stand in front of the store and wait for a customer to walk by carrying a shopping bag from the other store. He'd chat them up about their brand new phone, calling plan and warranty, then tell them they probably didn't need the extended warranty and that the accessories could be purchased at Walmart for half the price. He'd also say he could sell them the same phone with a better plan for less money. If they agreed, he'd walk them back to the other store, show the clueless sales rep how to void the sale, and then bring the customer to his store to pick up their new phone. It took about 3 months before the other store closed its doors. Next story. So, here's the background. The story I want to tell you is full of sadness and heartache. I started out life in poverty, living with my parents in a house that had some wooden floors but mostly dirt floors. My mother had a long list of mental health issues, and my father was an alcoholic. Thankfully, he was not the abusive type. My sister and I were taken from our home when I was 7 and she was 4. We were placed into the foster care system in Kentucky. I'm not going to use real names, but I will use the initials of their names. It's my understanding that, at the time, foster parents in Kentucky could have up to 4 kids per room, and there was no limit on how many children a single foster parent could take in. Linda's home was a long house with 6 bedrooms, and she was fostering at least 8 kids at the time. In the foster care system, it's not uncommon to see a child stay with us for just a week before being returned to their family, so we had different kids coming and going all the time. The foster home we went to was run by a woman we'll call Linda, who was a widow. Her husband had passed away in the 1980s. She had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Her youngest son, who we'll call Jay, was still living with her because he had fallen from a truck when he was a kid and damaged his skull. This caused him to have a learning disability, and he could not read or write. At the time I lived with them, he was about 26 years old. Her oldest son, Chase, was a plumber. Another son, Dean, owned 5 large farms and ran a grocery store. The 4th son, Cody, died in the 1980s from a gunshot wound. Her only daughter, Sandy, was very kind to us. When we entered the foster care system, it was a really scary time for us. I'll never forget the screams of our parents as they took us from our home because we didn't have running water or electricity. The old barn we had converted into a house wasn't suitable for children, according to our social worker. When I first arrived at the new house, I had a broken wrist and my arm was in a cast. The first thing we did was go shopping for clothes, as I didn't bring any with me. When we returned from shopping, I put my things away and was then given a trash bag and told to go outside and not come back in until all the loose trash was picked up. Just to let you know, this was more of a work camp than a loving and caring home. While I was picking up trash, Jay was in the swimming pool they had beside the home. He yelled for me to come to him and asked if I wanted to swim. I told him I didn't know how to swim and couldn't because of my broken arm. He then grabbed me and tossed me into the pool, and I screamed for help. I really felt like I was going to die that day. He took his time but eventually jumped in and pulled me out. He told me to stop crying and, in his words, said that if I drowned, no one would have cared because I didn't matter. I remember his words like it was yesterday. When I finally got to bed that night, I couldn't sleep and cried the whole night, missing my parents. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of 12 hard years of life to come. When I first arrived, Linda told me that another boy would be sharing my room with me, and he was away at camp for the week I arrived at her house, when school was out for the summer. His real name wasn't Ben, but we'll call him Ben. Ben had been in the home for a while and was about to turn 18. When you turn 18, the foster care system releases you, as you're considered a full-grown adult. When he returned from camp, he was a very large guy, about 6 feet 2 inches tall and 230 pounds, I'd guess. When I first met him, things seemed fine, but it was that first night of him being back that he tried to assault me. I already had a hard time sleeping because every day I wanted to leave and be back with my parents. He got up from his bed on the other side of the room and climbed into mine. He then held my nose shut so I couldn't breathe, and I had no choice but to open my mouth. He then pulled his pants down, and I think you can imagine what happened next. As he did this, I bit him. It was the only thing I could think to do. He jumped off me and hit me so hard that I was knocked out and don't remember anything else. The next morning, when I woke up with my face hurting and my mouth busted, I ran to tell Linda what he did to me. She took me into her bedroom to talk about it, and I told her everything. When she confronted him, he said I was trying to steal his money, and he hit me for it. I told her that wasn't true. He checked his wallet for his money and couldn't find it. He demanded his money back, and Linda searched my pockets. She pulled out a $20 bill, and she knew I had no money. She told me I was going to be punished and made me scrub the front porch. Ben had put his money in my pocket after he knocked me out, and I have no idea what else might have happened to me during that time. That night I cried and sat by the bedroom door in fear of being hurt again. I did this for a few nights and didn't get any sleep. I was falling asleep outside doing work and getting in trouble for it. One day, I was in my room playing with Hot Wheels that another foster kid let me have. Ben walked in, closed the door, and I just started screaming. He quickly jumped on me and covered my mouth. Linda was outside doing something and didn't hear me. He told me that if I screamed again, he'd have no choice but to hit me. I really couldn't do anything. I don't know what else would have happened to me because Linda came back inside and called for him to do something. This time I didn't lie down and cry at all. I just lay in place thinking about what to do. I decided I wasn't going to let him keep hurting me, so I went to the kitchen, sneaked a knife into my room, and put it under my pillow. That night, he got up and climbed into my bed. He told me to remember what would happen if I screamed or resisted. I told him I understood. I took the knife from under the pillow and hid it under the covers. He then grabbed my head and started pulling me close to him, and that's when I let him have it. I slashed him as many times as I could. He quickly disarmed me and ran out of the room into the bathroom. I ran to wake Linda and told her what happened, and she called 911. She told me not to say a word to the police about what happened and to go back to bed. Ben and Linda told the police that he'd been sleepwalking and didn't mean to cut himself. She told me that if I came out of my room and said anything to the police, they wouldn't believe me because I was a liar. After this happened, Ben never came back, and I don't know what happened to him, but I knew I wasn't going to let anyone do that to me again. Being told that I was worthless, didn't matter to anyone, and would never be anything was commonly said by Jay and Linda as they used those words to demoralize the kids. They treated all the foster kids this way, and would tell us we were lucky to be living with them, as this was the only way we wouldn't end up in jail. They told us that if we ever left, we'd end up in jail because we were just as worthless as our parents. I was also threatened with being sent to a boys' home, away from my sister, if I ever told anyone about how Linda treated us. At a young age, you don't know any better, sadly, and you're scared to think otherwise. Remember that this foster home housed boys and girls from all walks of life. Also, remember that Linda's 20-something son, Jay, lived with her as well. One night, I was up going to the bathroom when I heard faint crying. The crying was coming from the girls' room, and I went to find out what was wrong. I opened the door to find Jay on top of a girl who was about 16 years old or so. I ran to tell Linda, and he quickly ran out of the room after me. All the noise woke Linda up, and Jay told her that he had caught me sneaking into the girls' room. At this point, I was about 10 years old or so, and I tried to explain to her what happened. She told me I was telling lies and that I should be ashamed of myself. She said Jay would never do such a thing, and that I was in serious trouble tomorrow. I was punished by being made to clean out an old, filthy garbage bin they had behind the home, which was full of loose trash from ripped bags. The garbage bin was built of wooden pallets and was really large. They refused to give me gloves to pick up the trash, and, as you might know, trash often has food in it. Of course, all of this was rotten and full of maggots. It took me about 6 hours to clean it out. Later that week, when we went to the social worker's office for a visitation with my parents, I told the social worker what happened to the girl. She pulled me into a private room to talk about it. I told her everything that was happening, and she said she'd stop by tomorrow when we got home from school for a surprise visit. What I found out later in life is that the social workers in my county hated conflict and paperwork, so they would always give foster homes a heads up on visits. The next day, when we arrived home, her car was sitting in the driveway. When I walked in, she took the girl out to her car to have a talk. While the social worker was away, Linda told me that she knew what I'd done and that I was going to wish I had never opened my mouth. The social worker came back with the girl and sat in the living room with Linda, Jay, me, and all the other foster kids. She went on to tell us the importance of telling the truth and made an example out of me. She told the other kids not to tell lies like I did, as it caused unneeded stress and issues for everyone. After she left, Linda told me that she was going to make me pay for this, and it might not be today, but one day. Remember this phrase, it might not be today, but one day. When I turned 16, I had been in the foster care system for about 8 years, and my parents finally signed us over to the state. My social worker told me that she was going to place us in line to be adopted, and we'd be visiting with new parents in the following weeks. I was very heartbroken but also excited, as I couldn't wait to get away from Linda and her family. Weeks went by, and we never got to visit anyone, and I started getting worried. One day, Linda came to school to pick us up and told us that we were getting adopted today. I was really confused because we hadn't met with anyone. We arrived at the social worker's office and I went in with Linda. We went into a room where my parents were, and the paperwork was on the table. Because I was 16, I had to sign paperwork stating that I understood what was going on. The social worker told me that Linda was going to adopt us, and I started crying on the spot. I told them I would rather be dead than be adopted by her. The social worker told me she understood my anger because I hated to obey the rules. She was convinced that I hated Linda because I was a rebellious teenager who disliked following rules at that age. I told her it wasn't true, and she said she knew it to be true and didn't want to hear me tell any more lies. My parents were both crying, and they had already signed the paperwork weeks ago. Linda signed hers, and I refused to sign mine. The social worker told me that if I didn't sign, it wouldn't change anything, as I'd still be adopted by Linda. On the way home from the social worker's office, Linda looked up in the rearview mirror and gave me a long gaze that I'll never forget. She then said, "I told you one day you'll pay for what you've done, and that day has arrived." I felt chills run down my spine, and I was in complete shock. Even as I type this out now, I still get that same chill running down my spine, and I can see her eyes glaring at me in the mirror. Now that she had adopted me and my sister, we were no longer protected by the foster care system. With foster kids, you're not allowed to lay a hand on them to discipline them. But now that we were adopted, that restriction was gone. Things took a turn for the worse when Linda got mad. She would throw things at me, coffee cups, remote controls, chairs, anything she could get her hands on. At this point, I felt broken and alone. My sister was treated like a princess, and it's because she arrived at the home when she was 4, so she only knew Linda as her primary parental figure and always did what she commanded. My sister had no real understanding of who Linda was or how awful her family was. She was overjoyed about being adopted and having Linda's last name. My sister was essentially conditioned into thinking that Linda could do no wrong and that I was just a troublemaker. I felt like I had lost the only family I had. She was my everything, and I had sacrificed so much because I never wanted to be separated from her. My grand plan in life was to turn 18 and go live with my parents away from Linda and her family. It wasn't long after I was adopted that my father was diagnosed with cancer in his throat. I was crushed by this news, as my father was my hero. I was only with my parents until the age of 7, but they truly loved us and provided for us the best they could. My parents had never raised a hand to us growing up, and treated us with the love that kids need. At this point, we were doing home visits with my parents, as it wasn't easy for my father to travel. My father had been fighting cancer for a little over a year at this point. One day we were home for a visit with my father, and he was in really bad shape. My father lasted a few days and passed away from his liver shutting down. I was able to see him before he died, and he could squeeze my hand to let me know that he understood me. I made sure to tell him how much I loved him and promised to make him proud. I'm telling this part of the story because of how Linda and her family reacted afterward. They told me that people like my father were lazy, good-for-nothing individuals who lived off government checks paid for by working people. They said it was a good thing he was gone and that my mother needed to go too, as she also received government assistance. They told me this on the way home from the hospital. I sat in the back of the van in silence, not shedding a tear. I was no longer going to let them control me and keep me down. I made a promise to myself that I would do everything in my power to be better than them, and one day I'd show them what my pain felt like. My father passed away on October 25th, 12 days before I turned 18 on November 7th. My mother was soon after awarded to the state and placed into a nursing home due to her mental illness. The day after we laid my father to rest, I started working with my uncle, painting barns and sealing driveways. I had plans to go to Houston, Texas, and learn underwater welding, as that's where the money was. My uncle was paying me even on days we didn't find work to make sure I had enough money to make it on my own. I had saved up about $1,200 and graduated high school. My uncle had paid a driver to take me and Linda to Texas. Linda had to go with me because I was under the age of 25, and she had to sign paperwork stating that she would not be helping me with student loans. We set out for Texas, driving her van, as my uncle's truck had broken down the day before, and he only had a large work truck that wasn't feasible to take. We got about 4 hours into the trip, and Linda was getting frustrated. She ordered the driver to pull over in the next city. He did as she said because it was her van, and she kicked me out onto the sidewalk. I had a bag of clothes and $1,200 in cash in my pocket. They then took off, and I watched them drive away. I kept watching for a few moments to make sure they weren't coming back. I felt a wave of relief rush over my body. I was free. I was finally free. Of course, this wasn't where I wanted to be, as it was 4 hours south of Kentucky and nowhere near Texas. I picked up my bag and walked up the sidewalk, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I could get a bus ticket and make my way to Texas, but I didn't have the first idea where a bus station was. I came across a school in a shopping center and decided to check it out. I walked in and talked with the front desk about getting information on the school. She sent me to talk with a lady in admissions, and I explained my situation. She told me how I could get funding to attend there and how she could arrange housing for me that night. I went to this 2-year college and earned an associate's degree in computer science. I started working for a major computer company right out of college. I saved every dime I could and only spent money when I needed to. I bought my first truck with cash a year after starting my job. I was still keeping tabs on my sister back in Kentucky at this point. My sister was about to get married, and I was going to walk her down the aisle at the church that Linda always took us to growing up. Please understand that Linda was a prominent figure at her church and was well respected. This is important to understand for later. I drove up the weekend of the wedding and got a hotel room about an hour outside of where we grew up. My sister's best friend told me that my sister's fiancé was abusive, and she wanted to call off the wedding, but Linda told her she couldn't, and not to embarrass her at the church. Linda knew how he treated my sister, and had told her she needed to obey him, as he would be her husband. On the day of the wedding, I walked my sister down the aisle as planned. The pastor did his part, said some words, and then came the part where he asked if anyone thought they shouldn't be married, they must speak now. This is where I stood up and said I objected to my sister being married to an abusive man. You could hear a pin drop for a moment, and Linda's face turned blood red. I went on to say that Linda knew about the abuse and told my sister she was going to get married no matter what, and not to embarrass her here today. Linda then exclaimed that I was a known liar and that everyone knew they couldn't believe a word I said. The pastor at this point asked me to leave, but my sister spoke up for me, telling everyone what I said was the truth. Linda was later removed from the church's management and asked not to return, as they didn't condone abuse. It had been about 7 years since the wedding incident. I was now married, had a house of my own, and was living a great life. My sister married a good man who treated her well, and they had a wonderful little girl together. She called me one day to tell me that Linda's property taxes were significantly behind, and they hadn't gotten the tax lien lifted. Now, they were facing a tax deed sale of the property. I knew this was my chance to strike and pay them back for a fraction of the pain they'd caused me. I showed up at the auction, and the only other person to show up was Jay and his wife. When he noticed me, he turned pale and then tried to act friendly. I was polite, and he asked why I was there. I told him it was to keep the property in the family and that I had no problem helping out. I let him know that if I gained ownership, I'd pay the taxes for them so they wouldn't need to worry about this problem ever again. His brother Dean had given him the money needed to purchase the property back, so he had cash with him to pay for the taxes and fees. I told him to keep the cash and let him know that I'd take care of the taxes. The bidding started at a little over $2,000 because of the back taxes and fees. I bid on it, and Jay didn't. I easily won and now had instant ownership of the property. I went down to the courthouse with Jay and finished all the paperwork. Linda had fallen behind on property taxes because she was giving the money to Jay to pay them. It turned out that Jay was struggling with substance abuse and was using the money to buy drugs. Linda no longer fostered children because of her age and wasn't allowed to, so they had no income besides disability and Social Security. When I arrived at the house, I told Linda how I regretted being a difficult child and that, now that I was older, I had grown out of it. I let her know how much of a mother she was to me when I didn't have one and that I was here to pay her back. I told her that now that I owned the property, she'd never need to worry about property taxes ever again. I let her know that I was going to remodel her house, but she couldn't live in it at the same time. She told me she could stay at Dean's house while I was remodeling, and she was very excited. I told her not to worry about any of their belongings, as I'd make sure they were covered up and moved when needed. I informed her that a lawyer would be sending some paperwork to her in a few days. I then hired a lawyer to initiate an ejectment of Linda and Jay from the property. I don't know if I could have done this differently, but that was the advice I was given at the time. It took about 2 months for everything to be finalized and for them to be evicted. With them evicted, and since all their belongings remained in the house for over 30 days, I now owned everything. I contacted the local fire department to find out what I needed to do to burn a house down on my property. They informed me that it had to be a controlled burn. I'd need a permit to close the road since the home was near a public road, and I had to have the water shut off and the power disconnected. The fire department gave me a date and time when I was allowed to do the burning and coordinated with the sheriff's office to close the road. I got my permit from the city and then just had to wait. On the day of the fire, I prepped the house with lots of straw inside and made sure to take all the doors down and open all the windows, as I wanted it to burn as quickly as possible. I went to Dean's house to visit Jay and Linda. I told them I wanted to take them out by the old oak tree for lunch. This tree was in a field across the road from the home, and when we worked on the farm we would eat lunch in the summer under its shade. Linda was in a wheelchair and Jay had a bad back, so he didn't move around well and almost needed a wheelchair himself. I dropped them off and told them to enjoy the snack, saying I'd be right back as I was going to set fire to the old stuff I ripped out of the house. It's common where we live to burn trash. I called the fire department to let them know I was going to start the fire and made sure they had the address. I met with the officers closing the road to let them know I was about to begin and that they might encounter some family members trying to get by, but not to let them. I then went behind the house and started the fire from underneath with packed straw. I stood beside Linda and Jay while they ate and chatted with me about life and what I'd been doing with my career. It wasn't long before the fire started to peak around the sides of the home. They started screaming about the fire and that we needed to call 911. This is when I told them that I had the road closed and the fire department already knew I was going to burn my house down on my property. I told them what they were seeing was just a fraction of the pain they'd caused me over the course of my life, and I wanted them to know what a fraction of that pain felt like, as I could never fully make them understand. At this point Jay was trying to call his brothers, and I reminded him that I had the road closed and they couldn't get by. It took less than 20 minutes for the house to collapse into a heap of debris. The whole time I watched them as they sat and sobbed. About 30 minutes passed, and the fire was gone, with just smoke and embers glowing. I got into my car and drove back home, knowing they had lost almost everything they had. They didn't lose as much as I had, but it was the closest thing to it. Friends, that story was a real roller coaster. I've heard that the foster care system can be deeply flawed, and the fact that the foster mother took it upon herself to adopt kids solely to torment them is beyond twisted. I'm so glad that the original poster was able to achieve such a satisfying and legal revenge. I also love how he left them in the end, the same way they abandoned him. Bravo up! These stories are a gripping mix of workplace drama, betrayal, and poetic justice. Here's my take on each. The software tester's clash with Jay is a classic tale of a power-tripping boss. I admire the OP's resilience, using their deep company knowledge to outmaneuver Jay's baseless write-ups. His attempts to block the OP's work-from-home request over a medical condition were low, but forwarding HR emails with proof was a brilliant checkmate. Jay's demotion and firing felt like sweet justice. I've seen similar power struggles, and it's satisfying when bullies crash and burn. Pam's nepotism at the medical supply company infuriates me, firing competent staff to hire unqualified friends and family, like her clueless nephew, is a recipe for disaster. I love how the op played along, teaching the nephew just enough to sabotage the system by changing the admin password. Refusing to fix it for free and charging $200 hour as a consultant? Genius. Pam's downfall and the company's chaos were well earned. Bob's story at the cell phone store is a masterclass in subtle revenge. The manager's attempt to pin a theft on him was dirty, but Bob's strategy of poaching customers from his old store was brilliant. Driving them out of business by outselling them with better deals shows skill and patience. I respect his hustle, especially after being wronged. The foster care story is heart-wrenching. Linda and Jay's abuse, physical, emotional, and psychological, was horrific. I'm in awe of the op's strength, surviving and thriving despite their cruelty. Burning their house after buying it at a tax auction was a bold legal checkmate. Watching them sob as their home collapsed mirrors the pain they inflicted. It's a stark reminder of how broken systems can fail kids, but the OP's triumph is inspiring. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of another Our ProRevenge story. Boy, was that a long one. If you missed the last episode of Our ProRevenge, check it out if you haven't. I'll see you all in the next one. I love you!